My name is Elena Cross, and the night my father shouted, "Get out," something in me hardened forever. It wasn't just the words, it was the way everyone else reacted. Or didn't. My mother stared at the table like it had answers. My brother leaned back, arms crossed, already convinced I deserved it. Even my aunt nodded, slow and smug, like this was a correction long overdue. My father stood at the head of the table, red-faced and shaking, pointing toward the door as if I were a stain he'd finally scrubbed loose. I remember thinking how strange it was that no one asked why. No one questioned him. They all agreed without saying a word. That silence told me more than the shouting ever could. I stood up slowly, heart pounding, forcing myself not to cry. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and walked out without looking back. What they didn't realize, what made that moment almost laughable in hindsight, was that this wasn't the end of my story. It was the last time they would ever speak down to me, and none of them had the slightest clue what was already in motion behind the scenes. They thought they were throwing me out, but they were actually setting me free. The air outside felt colder than it should have, even for that time of year. I stood on the porch for a second, breathing hard, listening to the muffled sound of their voices resuming like I'd never existed at all. I didn't scream. I didn't slam the door. I walked to my car with a calm that surprised even me. Once inside, my hands shook so badly I had to sit there for a moment before turning the key. As I drove away, the house shrank in my rearview mirror, but the weight of everything I'd carried inside it stayed heavy in my chest. I replayed every memory where I'd been told I was too much, too ambitious, or not realistic enough. Every time my father had reminded me that I owed him obedience for raising me. What he never understood was that I'd been planning my independence quietly for years. Not loudly, not rebelliously, strategically. I drove until the familiar streets disappeared, until the anger settled into something colder, sharper. By the time I parked near the marina, I wasn't crying anymore. I was calculating, and that's when my phone buzzed, not with apologies, but with a notification that would change everything. The first domino had already fallen, whether they knew it or not. I slept in my car that night, curled awkwardly with my coat pulled tight, staring at the bark ceiling while the marina lights flickered outside. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt honest. No pretending, no performing, just me and the truth of where I stood. Around 6 a.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a random alert. It was a message from my attorney. Short, professional, loaded with meaning. Final confirmation received. Acquisition cleared. I sat up so fast my head hit the roof. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reread the message, making sure exhaustion wasn't messing with me. Months, years of planning had quietly led to this moment. Documents signed, funds transferred, ownership secured. I laughed once, softly, in the empty car. The timing felt unreal, almost cinematic. While my family slept comfortably, convinced they'd put me in my place, I was legally becoming the sole owner of a private island estate valued at $95 million. Not inherited, not gifted, earned. I stared out at the water, sunlight just starting to break through, and realized something that made my smile fade into something more dangerous. They had no idea who they had just told to leave. By mid-morning, I was on a plane. No dramatic goodbye posts, no calls, no explanations. I booked the flight under my LLC, the same one my family had laughed at when I first set it up. Playing businesswoman, my father had called it. I kept my headphones in as the city shrank below me, my mind racing through everything that had led here. Late nights, risks I never spoke about, deals I kept quiet because I knew no one in that house wanted to hear about my success unless they could claim it. The island wasn't some flashy resort. It was old stone, heavily fortified, designed for privacy. A castle, technically, the kind of place built to last storms, wars, and time itself. When the plane landed and I transferred to a boat, the salt air hit my face, sharp and clean. I felt lighter with every mile of open water between me and my past. When the island finally came into view, rising from the sea like something out of a myth, I felt a calm settle deep in my bones. This wasn't escape, it was arrival. And I still hadn't received a single call from my family. The first night on the island was silent in a way I'd never experienced before. No raised voices, no doors slamming, no tension humming beneath every conversation, just waves crashing gently against stone and wind moving through old trees. I walked through the halls slowly, fingertips brushing cold walls, grounding myself in the reality of it all. This place was mine, completely. I poured a glass of wine and stood on the balcony, watching the moonlight stretch across the water. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, my father was probably still congratulating himself for putting me in my place. I wondered how long it would take before someone noticed I wasn't begging to come back. I didn't block anyone. I didn't announce anything. I waited, because I knew how this worked. Silence unsettles people who expect submission, and I had mastered patience long before I mastered power. As I finally went to bed, phone face down, I felt something close to peace, but deep down I knew it wouldn't last. They would notice soon, and when they did, everything would change. 3 days passed before the first crack appeared. It wasn't a call from my father. It was a message from my cousin, short, awkward, pretending to be casual. "Hey, just checking in. You okay?" I didn't reply. A few hours later, another message followed, then another. Curiosity always beats pride eventually. By the end of the week, whispers had started. Someone had seen paperwork. Someone had heard about an acquisition tied to my name. A photo leaked. Me standing on the balcony, glass in hand, ocean behind me. It wasn't even flashy, but it was enough. My phone finally rang late that night. My father's name lit up the screen. I let it ring, then again, and again. Each unanswered call felt like balance being restored. The man who had screamed at me to leave now couldn't stand being ignored. I smiled faintly, turned the phone face down, and went back to sleep. For the first time, the silence was on my terms. The next morning, headlines started circulating quietly in financial circles. Nothing viral, nothing dramatic, just facts. An island estate acquisition finalized under a private holding company. Valuation confirmed. Industry insiders impressed. My father didn't live in those circles, but people around him did. By noon, the calls became texts, polite at first, then confused, then careful. "We should talk," one message read. Another asked where I was staying now. I finally replied to one, short and precise, "I'm fine." That was it. No location, no details. I spent the day walking the island's perimeter thinking about how strange it was that respect only appeared once power became visible. I wondered how many times I'd been dismissed simply because they thought I couldn't leave. The realization settled heavy but clarifying. This wasn't about revenge fueled by anger. This was about consequences revealing themselves naturally, and the biggest consequence hadn't landed yet. That evening, my father finally left a voicemail. His tone was unrecognizable. No shouting, no commands, just restraint. He said my name carefully, like it might break if handled wrong. He asked where I was, said he was concerned. I listened once, then deleted it. I wasn't ready to hear remorse shaped by fear instead of reflection. I knew the conversation would come eventually, but not on his timeline. I stood on the balcony again, watching the sunset bleed into the sea, and thought about how quickly authority collapses when it's exposed as conditional. They hadn't respected me when they thought I needed them. Now they didn't know how to speak to me at all. I slept better than I had in years that night, but the real confrontation was still ahead. 2 weeks later, the request came. Not a demand, a request. My father wanted to visit. The message was formal, almost businesslike, as if pretending we were equals might make it true. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no. I simply replied, "We'll see." That single line sent ripples through the family faster than any argument ever had. Suddenly, everyone wanted to reconnect. Apologies floated in without specifics. Compliments replaced criticism. I watched it all with detached clarity. Power doesn't shout, it waits. And for the first time, they were the ones waiting on me. What they didn't realize was that I had already decided how this would end. The night before I finally agreed to speak to my father, I sat alone in the castle's main hall, the echoes of my footsteps reminding me how far I'd come. I wasn't angry anymore. I was precise, calm, prepared. Whatever he expected from that conversation, tears, explanations, forgiveness, he wouldn't get it, because I wasn't there to prove anything. I had already done that the moment I walked out. I poured another glass of wine, phone resting beside me, knowing that tomorrow would redraw the final lines between who we used to be and who held the power now. And he still thought he was coming to reclaim control. I agreed to the call the next afternoon, not because I owed my father anything, but because timing matters when power shifts. He spoke first, cautiously, as if the wrong tone might disconnect the line. He asked if I was safe, then if I was comfortable, both questions landing hollow after years of indifference. I let him talk. Silence has a way of encouraging people to reveal what they're actually afraid of. When he finally paused, waiting for reassurance, I told him I was exactly where I wanted to be. No address, no hint, just certainty. He cleared his throat and said he'd heard things. I asked, what things? He stumbled, then admitted he'd seen documents, ownership records tied to a company he didn't recognize at first. My company. Hearing him say it out loud felt surreal. For the first time, the man who'd measured my worth by obedience sounded unsure. He asked when I'd done all this. I told him it took years. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked if we could meet. Not demanded, asked. I told him we'd discuss it later. When the call ended, I realized my hands were steady. That's how I knew the balance had truly shifted. He was beginning to understand, but not nearly enough. Word traveled fast after that call. My siblings reached out separately, each message tailored to what they thought would work. One joked, trying to pretend nothing had changed. Another apologized vaguely, careful not to admit specifics. I didn't respond to any of them. I wasn't interested in easing their discomfort. I spent those days settling into a routine on the island, meetings with staff, security briefings, quiet mornings overlooking the water. This place wasn't a trophy, it was infrastructure, stability, everything my father had claimed I lacked. At night, I replayed moments from my childhood, seeing them clearly now, without the fog of wanting approval. The criticism, the conditional praise, the way my success had always been minimized unless it served the family narrative. I realized they weren't shocked by my wealth, they were threatened by my independence, and that realization hardened my resolve. When my father finally sent another message, asking again to visit, I responded with conditions: neutral location, no audience, no dramatics. He agreed immediately. That eagerness told me more than any apology ever could. We met at a private marina lounge, understated and quiet. He arrived early, I arrived on time. The moment he saw me, his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable. He stood, unsure whether to hug me. I didn't make it easier. We sat across from each other, a small table between us that felt symbolic. He started with an apology that circled responsibility without landing on it. I let him finish. Then I spoke, not emotionally, not loudly, but clearly. I told him how it felt to be told to leave while everyone agreed, how silence can wound deeper than shouting. He tried to interrupt. I held up a hand. He stopped. That moment alone felt like a victory. I explained that I hadn't built my life to spite him. I built it because I learned early not to rely on validation that could be withdrawn at any moment. He listened, eyes fixed on the table. When I finished, he asked if I was angry. I told him no. Anger assumes you want something back. I didn't. What I wanted was recognition of reality. He nodded slowly, like someone recalibrating a worldview. And then he asked the question he'd been dreading. He asked if I planned to come home. I didn't laugh. I didn't soften it. I told him I already was home, just not the one he controlled. The words landed heavier than I expected. He leaned back, processing. For the first time, I saw him not as an authority, but as a man confronting the limits of it. He asked if there was anything he could do to fix this. I told him yes. Respect my boundaries. Stop rewriting the past to soothe the present, and understand that access to my life was no longer automatic. He agreed too quickly, which told me he hadn't fully absorbed what that meant. We ended the meeting politely. No reconciliation, no explosion, just an understanding that the rules had changed. As I walked away, I felt lighter, not because I'd forgiven him, but because I'd reclaimed the narrative. He watched me leave, and I knew he finally understood what it felt like. But the family wasn't done testing those boundaries yet. Within days, the pressure escalated, invitations disguised as apologies, requests framed as concern. My mother called, crying softly, asking when I'd let this go. I told her there was nothing to let go of, only something to accept. She didn't like that answer. Neither did my siblings when I declined a family gathering to clear the air. They wanted optics, closure that benefited them. I wanted distance that protected me. The more I refused, the more desperate they became. That desperation revealed itself in small, telling ways: guilt-laced messages, passive-aggressive remarks about how money changes people. I ignored them all. The island remained calm, predictable, safe, and that contrast made their chaos even louder. I realized then that my absence wasn't punishing them, it was exposing them, and exposure is something some families can't survive. The breaking point came when my father announced, without asking, that he planned to visit the island. He framed it as a courtesy. I treated it like a boundary violation. I responded immediately, firm and unambiguous. No visits without invitation, no exceptions. The reply came slower this time. When it did, it was defensive, hurt, accusatory. He reminded me of everything he'd done for me. I read it twice, then deleted it. Some conversations don't deserve oxygen. That night, I stood on the cliffs, watching waves crash against stone, thinking about how often gratitude is weaponized to excuse control. I slept deeply, knowing I'd made the right choice. The next morning, everything hit the public eye. An article circulated more widely than expected, still factual, still restrained, but impossible to ignore. My name was finally attached, not as someone's daughter, but as an owner, an investor, a force. Phones rang nonstop, messages poured in, old acquaintances resurfaced. My family went quiet. That silence wasn't peaceful, it was stunned. I imagined my father reading the article, realizing there was no version of this where he could claim credit, no rewrite that centered him. I didn't celebrate, I simply continued my day. Power, once normalized, loses its novelty. And that's when my father asked for one last meeting. He asked to see me alone, again. No intermediaries, no family, just us. I considered it carefully, not because I feared him, but because endings deserve intention. I agreed, this time on my terms. On the island, controlled, secure. When he arrived, escorted and visibly overwhelmed, I met him at the entrance. No hug, no hostility, just distance. We walked together in silence, the castle looming behind us. He finally spoke, admitting he'd underestimated me. That word mattered. I told him acknowledgement wasn't the same as repair. He nodded slowly, but he still hadn't heard the part that would change everything. I told him he wasn't here to regain a relationship. He was here to understand its limits. I explained that I would decide when and how we spoke going forward, that my life was not a shared asset. He listened, eyes wet but composed. For the first time, he didn't argue. When I finished, he asked if I was happy. I answered honestly, yes. The simplicity of it seemed to break something in him. We stood there, wind cutting between us, two people finally seeing each other without illusion. And then I delivered the final truth. I told him that being told to get out had been the greatest gift he ever gave me, because it forced me to choose myself without apology. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. He said he understood. I believed him, at least enough to let the conversation end there. As his car disappeared down the drive, I felt no triumph, just closure. And closure, I learned, is the most powerful form of revenge there is. But the story wasn't finished yet, not for them. After my father left the island, I didn't feel empty. I felt settled. For years, my life had revolved around proving I wasn't what they said I was. Now, there was nothing left to prove. The castle wasn't about wealth or spectacle. It was about permanence, something no one could take away with a raised voice or a cruel sentence. I returned to my routine, knowing the hardest part was behind me, choosing myself without guilt. A week later, I heard from extended family. Cousins who'd never checked in before suddenly wanted to reconnect. Aunts sent long messages about forgiveness and unity. None of them mentioned the night my father shouted, "Get out!" None of them mentioned how everyone agreed. Silence had been their vote back then. I treated it as final. What surprised me most was how calm my life became once I stopped explaining myself. No more defending choices, no more shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. Peace arrived quietly. No announcement, no applause, just mornings without dread and nights without replaying old arguments. Months passed. My business expanded. New partnerships formed, built on contracts, not blood. People respected boundaries here. They didn't confuse access with entitlement. For the first time, I felt what real belonging was supposed to feel like, chosen, not demanded. One evening, I received a short message from my father. No guilt, no pressure, just a sentence. "I hope you're doing well." I read it once and didn't respond. Not out of anger, but because silence, when intentional, can be healthy. I realized then that revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like absence, like building a life so full that the people who doubted you no longer have a role in it. The memory of that night, the shouting, the agreement, the door closing behind me, no longer hurt. It felt distant, like a chapter I'd already survived. I didn't rewrite it, I didn't deny it. I simply outgrew it. Standing on the balcony of the island castle, watching the horizon fade into evening, I understood something important. Success didn't change me. It revealed who had always been waiting underneath the doubt. My family thought telling me to leave would break me. Instead, it freed me. Their rejection became my direction. Their certainty became my motivation. And their silence now was confirmation. They told me to get out, and everyone agreed. So I left, and I built a life so solid, so undeniable, that no one could ever vote me out again.